Tatiana Renierson, University of Rhode Island. So several of you talked about heat waves, which is interesting to learn about from different perspectives. And you also talked a little bit about community composition changes, perhaps an example from the kelp forest off the coast of Australia. Have you or anyone else been thinking about the influence of these heat waves, either immediately or in the long term, on carbon flux in these particular regions?
I would say vaguely, in that I have thought about the potential implications but have no measurements. But my feeling is that, well, it's very complicated. The more we learn about the taxa that are out there in the middle of the blob, as opposed to what we see on the coast, the more confused I get about what is happening. So for instance, I was just talking to Angel White earlier, and she reminded me that there's this massive swarm of pyrosomes out there just filling all the fishing nets, which has really big implications on carbon flux. And the small copepod community, the warm water community that I see during the blob on the shelf tends to be thought to have lower carbon export potential. So in general, I'm thinking about it, but no conclusions yet.
Well, go ahead. Maybe I can add to that. I mean, in the terrestrial biosphere, we see that actually drought events and heat waves are really the major factor in explaining like this short-term variability in carbon fluxes. And I think, yeah, that's something we should probably also look at in the ocean realm. But then I don't know so many studies which have been so far done on this topic.
It's not particularly loud, so I'll put that between you if you need to speak right into it.
Karen Wishner, University of Rhode Island. Sort of for all of you, I'm a seagoing oceanographer. You know, I collect things, I see them as they are at that moment in time. And I was wondering if you can address the challenges or what you're doing individually to go from that small scale variability, that immediate variability that you see, of course, over the several days of a cruise or something like that, to these bigger models that try to give us the global perspective. I think that's a major challenge and just what you're doing today.
No, I agree. I mean, I think it's really interesting. You always end up with these kind of essentially climate versus weather, right? Are you, and it comes down in some ways to what your question is. Are you interested in kind of the large scale aggregate behavior? Or are you thinking about what's happening at a particular location at a particular time? I think, the other thing I'm really starting to think about is the question of whether you can just kind of translate an ecosystem state from one kind of niche into as that niche moves, or really how are we seeing changes in how things get assembled over time? So a small perturbation, does that sort of send you on a different trajectory? And that's where I think lab experiments and observations are going to be really important. I think we can, for temperature, we can kind of do that pretty well with these large scale models and with satellites and things like that. But I think the ecology, especially as you move to the lower trophic levels, really requires that detail.
Jenkins, University of Rhode Island. Thank you all for such really nice talks. And my question really goes to Phoebe, because this is a new area for me. But I'm wondering, in the fishery that you're working with, U.S. is obviously regulating catch size in terms of our EEZ waters. But the minute you move out of that, what are the adjacent, longline tuna fishing countries doing, and how is that impacting the ecosystem?
Yeah, so I can say probably two things to that question. One, so Big Eye is kind of tricky. It's regulated for the entire Pacific. So on one sense, I mean, the U.S. is a very small piece of that puzzle, and we do hear that from our fishermen, that they're a small piece overall, and if they're following the rules, it doesn't really matter because other people aren't, and so that is a challenge. On the other hand, we've looked at where, like, the spatial mapping of effort, and there's some parts where the fishery in Hawaii is really active that international fishermen aren't fishing in those waters, even though it's outside our EEZ. So I would say that that seems to indicate that there are examples where our management can actually have an impact on the environment. So in some respect, it's challenging, but there are areas, I think, where we can have an influence. Yeah.
I'll ask one, and then pass it on. Andy, you kind of riffed on this a little bit, but you mentioned that in proposals and your work you had used climate perturbations occurring now and in the near future as potential analogs for future warming. And I guess I'm wondering, you know, how accurate is this? Is a warm event now, say for example the Pacific warm blob, is that really an analog for a future event or a future warming scenario? Or is it something very, very different and we're wrong to try to compare them? So, in what ways are they similar and in what ways are they different?
So I'll turn to lobsters because that's where my head is these days. And you know, one of the things that we've been doing is looking at the lobster population in New England. So the lobster fisheries essentially collapsed here in southern New England. It's at record levels in the northern Gulf of Maine and in Canada. We can kind of look at what the recruitment temperature relationship is, and what we find is that there's a very similar temperature relationship, but the potential productivity in these different ecosystems is different, and that's set by essentially probably by the habitat. So you have rocky coast in Maine, which lobsters like to hide in. You have sandy coast down here. So that's constrained things. So as you move these communities across the map, while many things are moving together, there are also a few things that are fixed. So the geology is fixed for anything that's living on the bottom. For plankton, the light field is going to be fixed. And so, you know, trying to figure out how do these fixed effects versus these more random moving effects interact, I think that's really an open question. And it gets to then the challenges when you do things like, say, species distribution models, where you take, you know, the last 30 or 40 years of the trawl survey data here in New England. We build all these models of how we think fish relate to temperature and habitat, and then try to project those forward. I think it's really challenging, because in all of those cases, you're essentially assuming you can just kind of linearly apply what you know now to the future. And so I think it argues for a much more process-based view than we've had, and where even things like, you know, I've in my career had a number of like NAO type correlations or salinity correlations, and frankly, you know, those things have tended to fall apart. Some of it could be statistical, but I think there's also some of it is just the behavior of the system is changing, and so this kind of 30-year empirical view is starting to become less useful.
Hi, Ben Twining, Bigelow Laboratory, and thanks all for great talks. My question, I guess, is mostly for the first speaker, though maybe it follows from Andy's comments too. You showed a plot looking at the sources of uncertainty with these models, and in particular one of the aspects was the uncertainty associated with the ecological, I think, parameterization, if I read that correctly. And I'm wondering, for those of us who sort of live in the mechanistic plankton world, if there are takeaways or specific aspects that contribute more to that uncertainty or inability to have certainty in your predictions going forward? I mean, are there aspects of the planktonic biogeochemistry that would be more useful to try to constrain, or is it just sort of one big box of uncertainty? If that makes any sense.
Well, I mean, yeah, there are now some papers published which have looked at the model uncertainty and what drives the uncertainty. And some of the uncertainty just come from the physical climate, how the ocean actually, how fast it gets stratified and so on. But for NPP, for example, there is also a large uncertainty just stemming from the grazing term. So how the different biogeochemical model actually model this grazing term and how it's dependent on temperature, for example. And for NPP, just one example, so if you look at the base state, the climatological mean, I mean, some models actually show like a biomass or NPP of about 10 petagram carbon, and others show like 80 petagram carbon. So already the base state is so different. So there's no wonder that actually the changes are also quite different. So, but I would say it's still, I don't know which one is more important, the physical side or more the biogeochemical side.
It sounds like there's plenty of uncertainty to go around on the biogeochemical side. Thanks.
Thank you once again for 4 beautiful talks this morning. My question is actually for Andy, and it's a policy-related question. And you alluded to the fact, actually to Thomas as well, you alluded to the fact that we have a big problem in communicating our science, to, especially to skeptics. And I wonder how we can do it when we show things like the ensemble projections for the future. You know, there's such a big variation. And, you know, it's really difficult to convince a skeptic when you have that kind of graph to show him with that much uncertainty. So how do we move forward?
That's a huge challenge. You know, I think it's something we all face. One of the things that's coming up is how do you talk to people about essentially things that are scary and where there isn't a lot of hope. So that can be a lot of the climate communications literature really focuses on trying to give people hope and the idea that you can do something, and while still giving them a sense for what the scale of the challenges are. That message is really hard to talk about when you're talking about sea ice ecosystems, or if you're talking about coral reefs, where the magnitude of hope is quite small, and where adaptive action is really, really limited, where the only thing really is bending the carbon curve. So I think it's a huge challenge. One of the things I've been doing in some of the public talks I've been giving that I've gotten some reasonable feedback on is focusing on the going backwards in time and looking at some of the early climate predictions and how well they've played out. So Jim Henson's 1981 famous science paper made some very concrete predictions about the end of the 20th century. So we can actually look at the data and see whether those early papers were right. And for the most part, they got a lot of the really big signals correct. And so you can talk to people and say, well, look, 30 years ago, this is what somebody said, and here's what we showed. So here's what we're saying now, and here's what it showed. So you can kind of try to build a little bit of confidence in our ability to project.
Is this on? Yes, it is. My name is Barney Balch. I'm from Bigelow Lab. And I really enjoyed these talks. And my question is for Thomas and Andy, primarily. And I was captivated by your quadruple whammy comment. And your talk was one of the few that talked about some of these other effects, the ocean acidification and such. And do the models incorporate what the time scales are for the response of temperature perturbations, OA perturbations, and oxygen perturbations in your case? Because these nonlinearities, which is what Andy was talking about, are probably a function of the response times of these major perturbations. And I would imagine that the OA response that you have to build in is going to be has a much longer time scale. Similarly, the heat wave that a number of you referred to, that's also going to be related to the hydrological cycle. So freshwater inputs near the coast and such. So my question is really about how well the models are parameterizing these nonlinear responses to the quadruple whammy, if you were.
Well, they incorporate that. I mean, yeah, I would say, well, it's a tough question. But I think they have the major, well, at least for ocean acidification, I mean, we have a pretty good understanding how ocean acidification, at least at the surface, will change and what the time scale of response is. For oxygen, I would say, yeah, it's not so well understood. So, for example, in the low oxygen zones, if you only look at the low oxygen zones, these models, some show actually increase in the oxygen minimum zones, extend in the future, some a decrease. So these things are not really well understood, I think. But that probably has to do also with the resolution. So I'm showing model simulations which have a really coarse resolution, just 1 degree. And for some aspects, for example, also for coastal regions, that's not a really good, not enough good resolution. And yeah, maybe you can also add to that.
Well, so I'll add one quick thing in that for the climate assessment review, we were really focusing on temperature, acidification, and deoxygenation as the 3 big physical drivers in the ocean. And for temperature, there's lots of great literature out there about temperature effect on, and again, we have this point of view of trying to connect to people. So the higher up the trophic level you go, the more likely we are to be able to make that link. So the temperature links are really strong. The oxygen and the oxygen links are pretty strong as well because we have a lot of events. The OA links are really weak, in that I don't think we can say that there's a fishery around the world where OA has become an important driver or limitation of the recruitment of that fishery. Fish.
It's a
No,
fishery.
yeah, there we go. Yes, oysters.
Oysters.
Okay, thank you.
But otherwise, your point is.
Yeah.
One very quick question for the zooplankton people. Can you get zooplankton from space in any way?
Is Todd O'Brien in the room? There are now maps of zooplankton biomass created from algorithms from satellites. And NASA has just funded a program to do a better job of getting zooplankton from space. I'm pretty sure, like a couple of proposals I think got funded, I hope. And so my opinion is right now, not so much. We make predictions based on production regimes, and we basically, apply a growth factor to NPP and say, predict zooplankton biomass, but it's not great. We need a lot more work in that regard.
Uta Passo, UC Santa Barbara. So this was a follow-up question to what you just talked about. I think the real problem will be, even if we have those physical parameters and then maybe can think about the biological responses, that there will be interacting effect. So any kind of organism responds differently to a change in temperature if at the same time there's a change in oxygen concentration. And those effects will not be additive. Is there any attempts in ecosystem models to try to look at these non-linear interactive effects?
Not that I know of.
Well, actually, I'll just add a little bit to that. I think that Sam Sidlecki at the University of Washington GISAO program she is starting to put zooplankton into her biogeochemical model, which does have oxygen and acidification very well parameterized. So she may eventually be able to back out the interactive effects on zooplankton. But it's going to be an NPZ sort of zooplankton, so it's still very simplified at this point. But she's getting there. She's making some really good progress.
Francisco Chavez from Mbari. As Julie showed, there's actually increases in biodiversity during warm years, which is typical. Productivity and biodiversity are inversely related at times. But yet we're constantly talking about declines in biodiversity under warmer conditions. So how do we resolve that apparent conflict?
So I think there's a lot of confusion over what biodiversity means. So I think to scientists in the room, we are probably going to say, we're going to go out and we're going to count the number of species. And for most ecosystems that get warmer, you're going to find an increase in biodiversity. I think the exception, and I think Thomas's, the Chung et al. Study really gets at that in the modeling work on fish, that you have limitations in the tropics where there really isn't a warmer environment to recruit from. But in the popular press, especially in kind of the conservation, biodiversity just means losing a species I care about. And so I think there's a lot of confusion over that term. So that would be mine. Or often when you're talking about biodiversity loss, people are talking only about big, species that we're likely to care about.
University of Rhode Island. I want to follow up on something Professor Wishner brought up. These observations that we collect are often very species-specific, highly variable on small time and space scales. Do you know of good examples where large-scale predictive models incorporate these? And I like the examples this morning that showed sort of constraints on variability that you can place. But do you know of examples? And if not, what would be a good way forward to make progress on taking empirical data and incorporating it into large-scale models?
So I know that in the cobalt model, they did a lot of work with global data sets to try and validate that model. So that's one example where a lot of individual time series at different points around the globe were actually used to tune that model and make sure it was representative of the past. So that's one example that I know of.
Yeah, and just to extend on that, I think all of these models are going to have, response curves that have been parameterized, you hope, in pretty much all cases based on some data sets. And so the observations are really critical for getting those, functional feeding responses, for getting the rate measurements. I think you're not likely to see, individual observations getting assimilated into a model to try to affect the state, but the experimental work I see as being really critical for getting the process and the mechanisms right so that you have a model that actually can work.
It's on, okay. Hi, Debbie Steinberg again from VIMS. So I'm thinking a little bit about top-down control after listening to all of your talks. And Julie, your observation about the larvations decreasing, and you're wondering why, and I'm thinking, well, maybe there was a predator that moved in with the blob. And then with your, Phoebe, with your talk, changes in the fishery. And so I don't know if it's a question or a comment, but I just think it's something that we look at these changes and we always attribute it to bottom-up control. And I know that's what this session was about, but we need ways also of looking at the effects of predation on these patterns and, running cobalt model backwards. Yeah, I know that's a very naive statement, but I don't know. Do you have any comments about how we get at that? It's been, I know, something in my own work it's been an issue when I see patterns I can't explain, and I don't know if it's top down, bottom up. So, anybody?
So that is one thing that we look at a lot with ecosystem modeling. So we've done some work from a species-based perspective and size-based perspectives. And so doing things where you hold the base of the food web constant, but you have increased predation from above, and then vice versa, and then you can run them together and try and tease that apart. That's definitely something that we're working on. And then that thinking is that if you can understand from your model what those different responses look like, then when you look at actual time series, you can try and relate them to those changes. But it's kind of a forever ongoing question about where you're squeezing the ecosystem from. And it's always all happening at the same time, right? So.
Right, it's hard to tease apart, but I think we need to do a better job on that, because it's, yeah.
Yeah, and as an observationalist, my approach with this type of problem, like the larvation disappearing problem or others, has been to try to find the most likely solution and see if it answers anything. So for instance, there are some juvenile salmon that feed on larvations. Maybe I could find stomach content data across different years and see if they were preying differentially on them in 2015 and 16. But it's like one potential answer where then there's all these other things that I can't explore. So it's unsatisfactory, but sometimes we can get hints of whether there's top-down controls or not.
We'll take one final question from Peter here, and then we'll wrap up.
There we go. A lot of the zooplankton sort of tendencies in the model have concentrated on the crunchy zooplankton, the copepods and euphausids. And I've been struck in working with Jules Jaffe, who's developed all these beautiful underwater microscopes, that a lot of what we see are really small gelatinous zooplankton, little hydromedusae and really small larvaceans and things that just don't get captured in nets. Do you have any sense of, A, will models ever include these things, and B, what are we missing by not including these things in our models and our climate predictions?
Go for it.
We can both talk at the same time.
All right.
So first, I think that we're getting a lot better at assessing those now that we know how important they are. There are more optical measurements and better, finer mesh net toes that collect those critters. And certainly, I think my community is thinking about them and their importance more and more. And we definitely have been missing them, and they're hugely important in carbon cycling, if not so much in trophic webs. But like these pyrosomes I mentioned a bit ago, they're probably not fed on by much of anything, and yet they're clearing the water column of everything else. So they're hugely important, and we do need to think about them. And I can't answer the question about whether they're getting into models, so this guy will.
So I'll say one of the challenges, I'm not doing work on some of the global models, but we have thought a little bit about some size spectrum modeling work. And what's really fascinating about the gelatinous species is that they break the size spectrum, right? Because they feed like they're large, but they metabolize like they're small. And we had some ideas for how to do that and haven't quite gotten that work funded yet. But I think there's some neat things that can be done. I think they're really important. And to bring it back to some of the heat wave stories, they tend to be a group of organisms that can respond really quickly to these conditions. So we saw in 2012 and 2013 a lot of jellyfish along the coast, an unusual amount of jellyfish on the coast of Maine, to the point where people are calling us, why are there so many jellyfish? And we didn't have the data to be able to explain really even whether it was unusual, but because people were asking, we were assuming it was.
With that, I'd like to thank our speakers and this panel's discussion.